In 1878, the colony of South Australia started building a railway north of Port Augusta and promptly sold the infrastructure to the Commonwealth Government upon federation. It took some time for the Commonwealth to make good its promise to extend the railroad. It was 1926 before work began and took a further 3 years of construction by horse and hand before it arrived at its destination in Alice Springs. Even then, the dream to link Darwin to the southern states was very much alive. Being a steam train, the course of the railroad was largely determined by the availability of an adequate water supply. Too much water was sometimes the case. Rivers in flood played havoc with the reliability of the narrow gauge line, creating frequent interruptions to the transport of goods and people for weeks at a time. This fragility was keenly felt during the war years, when Alice Springs became a supply depot for the army. Weaponry, troops and goods bound for Darwin were no use to anyone when marooned upside down in the desert. At the time, and as a result of short-sighted colonial rivalries, Australia was an unholy conglomeration of different gauge tracks, which meant trains had to be unloaded then reloaded at each state border.
6 different gauges, 100 different engines, 1,000 different trucks. Look ahead, break down the barriers, throw a single line of steel about Australia, climbing Barkly Tableland, joining Darwin to the south.
At the behest of the federal government, the so-called standard gauge became all the rage, and a flurry of nation-building ensued. With the demise of steam and the rise of diesel engines, the rail link to Alice Springs was reimagined. Work started in 1975, just before Gough Whitlam self-combusted.
831 kilometres of track through some of the harshest terrain in Australia. Blistering hot days, bitterly cold nights, dust and flies, and torrential rains.
By 1980, the railway was complete, and with some pageantry, the first locomotive arrived.
And provides the first stage of a modern link between the Northern Territory and the southern states. A line to Darwin is being planned for completion by 1988.
The Alice to Darwin Railway was Australia's first major infrastructure project of the 21st century. Aided by significant improvements in railway engineering and construction, the 1,410-kilometre extension took just 2 years to complete. 2 million concrete railway sleepers were made in Tennant Creek and Katherine, which, along with locally mined ballast to hold the sleepers in place, were delivered to the progressing railheads like clockwork each day. Then, in 2003, the last welder was performed, signalling the completion of the construction phase, with the first train to travel the length of the extension following shortly thereafter. Today marks 10 years since the Ghan left Alice Springs Station bound for Darwin for the very first time. What a journey it's been.